A lot of people remember their first Star Trek episode or their first Star Trek movie, but I don't. For as long as I can remember, it's just been perpetually on TV in its various forms. I grew up watching the original series in The Next Generation, and later in my teens watched all of Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and then kept up with the franchise through its more recent incarnations. Star Trek helped jumpstart my imagination, and helped me figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. It's a franchise which means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it all started with one man. The concept for Star Trek was of course created by Gene Roddenberry. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1921, his father was a Los Angeles police officer. From an early age, Roddenberry was an avid reader of pulp magazines. He was an enormous fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars, as well as the Skylark series by E.E. Smith. In his college years, he became interested in aeronautical engineering, which eventually led to him joining the US Army Air Corps, where he served during World War II. After the war and a brief career as a pilot for Pan American Airways, Roddenberry followed in his father's footsteps to become a Los Angeles police officer. All throughout his law enforcement career, however, he dreamt of becoming a writer, and he would later cite his experiences as a police officer as one of the major contributors to his most famous creation. While working in the police department's Public Information Division, Roddenberry was brought in as a technical advisor on a new television version of Mr. District Attorney. It was from this role as an advisor, Roddenberry was able to land his first writing gig for the same show, under the pseudonym Robert Weasley. After successfully contributing scripts to Mr. District Attorney, as well as Highway Patrol, Roddenberry saw his chance to pursue his dream, and soon quit his job in the police department. Throughout most of the 50s, Roddenberry would write freelance, contributing to numerous westerns such as Have Gun Will Travel, as well as other cop and military-focused shows. It was during this time Roddenberry met actor DeForest Kelley, as well as actress Majel Lee Hudick, later known as Majel Barrett. At the start of the 60s, however, Roddenberry set his sights on creating, writing, and producing his own original TV show. The burgeoning idea for Star Trek first entered his mind at this time. He often talked with friends about the concept of a racially diverse crew in an airship exploring the world, inspired by Jules Verne's Master of the World. However, this idea wasn't fully formed, and instead Roddenberry went on to create The Lieutenant. The Lieutenant was a military drama following the lives of several personnel on a base with the backdrop of the unfolding Cold War. It was here Roddenberry also met future Star Trek producer Gene L. Coon, as well as actors Gary Lockwood, Leonard Nimoy, and Nichelle Nichols, who landed her first television role on The Lieutenant. It was a well-received show, but one which generated controversy behind the scenes when Roddenberry's goal of a progressive racial equality message clashed with the Department of Defense, which was supporting the show. These clashes eventually led to the department withdrawing its support entirely, and with a suddenly much more expensive series on their hands, MGM and NBC couldn't commission a second season. With his military drama off the air, Roddenberry revisited his original idea of a racially diverse crew on a mission of exploration. Rather than the Jules Verne aesthetic, he drew from the pulps he grew up reading, particularly Smith's Skylark series. For the overall look of the show, he took heavy inspiration from the landmark science fiction film Forbidden Planet, and for the captain of his ship, he drew from C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower novels to craft the character. By March 11, 1964, he had completed a 16-page pitch. On April 24th, he registered the new series with the Writers Guild of America. He titled this new show, Star Trek. It's hard to imagine just how different the TV landscape was at the time. American TV was dominated with the westerns, thrillers, and dramas Roddenberry had cut his teeth on in the 50s. There was very little in the way of science fiction, at least of the type Roddenberry was envisioning. Across the pond in the UK, Doctor Who had only just begun airing its first few episodes. In the US, the space opera adventure serials of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers had long since passed. Sci-fi of the time was embodied by high-concept morality plays like the seminal Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, although they too were winding down by the mid-60s. In general, there really was nothing like what Roddenberry was proposing on TV at the time. While his pitch was well received at MGM, who had produced The Lieutenant, they didn't make him an offer. Roddenberry then took it to Desilu Productions. They the company co-founded by actress, comedian, presenter, producer, and writer Lucille Ball, known for her hit sitcom I Love Lucy. Roddenberry took his pitch to head of programming Oscar Katz, and the two began pitching to the networks. Funnily enough, their first stop was CBS, however they were already developing their own sci-fi show Lost in Space at the time, and so they passed on Star Trek. Next, they took it to NBC. Allegedly during the meeting, Roddenberry struggled to convey his concept to the executives, and believed he was blowing it. That is, until Oscar Katz leapt into the conversation and pitched Star Trek as a space western, downplaying the sci-fi elements. It was here the phrase "wagon train to the stars" was coined. Convinced by Katz's exciting-sounding pitch, NBC agreed to greenlight a pilot. With production at Desilu now underway, Roddenberry quickly set about assembling his team. He brought on Robert Justman, who was a producer on The Outer Limits at the time, and Herbert F. Solow joined the team from the board at Desilu. Hua Chang was also brought over from The Outer Limits to supervise much of the production design and creature effects work. For the music of the show, Roddenberry approached composer Jerry Goldsmith. However, due to other commitments he had at the time, he couldn't join the project. Instead, Goldsmith recommended Alexander Courage for the job. While mostly a music arranger at the time, Courage's work in creating the iconic Star Trek theme tune speaks for itself. His work lends Star Trek an epic, operatic feel, quite different from the atmospheric tones or bombastic cues of other shows at the time. For the cast, Roddenberry had written the role of Number 1 with Majel Barrett in mind, and so she was the first to be cast. With the role secured, it was Barrett who recommended Leonard Nimoy for the part of Spock. All three having had a good working relationship on The Lieutenant, Roddenberry and Nimoy were enthusiastic to collaborate on a new show. The character of James T. Kirk was yet to be created. Instead, Jeffrey Hunter was cast as Captain Christopher Pike, a name inspired by a character Roddenberry had created for the pilot The Wild Blue. The Cage, originally named The Menagerie, was a costly venture, with some accounts stating its price tag as over $600,000, more than 3 times what was normal for a TV episode at the time. Shooting began on November 27, 1964, and was completed by December 11th. After several weeks of post-production work, the very first episode of Star Trek was delivered to NBC. It's worth noting that for a franchise known for its sense of an optimistic future, The Cage is a much more somber and gritty story than today's Trekkies may expect. The Enterprise, rather than the flagship of a mighty fleet, is a well-worn vessel staffed by a skeleton crew. Captain Pike, rather than a heroic lead, begins the episode tired of command and the responsibilities that come with it. It's also worth noting how emotional Spock seems to be in this episode. The cultural concept of the Vulcans had not really fully materialized, and Nimoy, seeing the relatively low energy of Hunter's performance, sought to balance the dynamic by lending more humor, sarcasm, and even passion to his performance. Overall, The Cage is a fine sci-fi story with interesting themes and ideas. The Enterprise responds to a false distress call from a ship long thought lost. Pike is soon kidnapped by a race of powerful telepaths who destroyed their world in a long-forgotten war. In his prison, the aliens, who name themselves as Telosians, conjure telepathic visions to try and force him into a romantic relationship with the only survivor from the crashed ship, Vina, in the hopes their union will birth a slave race which could rebuild the Telosians' homeworld. It's well-worn stuff in today's Star Trek, but for the 60s, this was quite a taboo-busting story. Much discussion surrounds notions of sex and relationships, possibly threatening the legitimacy of the nuclear family of the time. Questions are raised as to if human behavior, despite its advancement, could still be manipulated like animals trained in a zoo. Jeffrey Hunter is a compelling lead in an Old West kind of way. While his dialogue is full of clever deductive reasoning and his characterization depicts him as a resourceful and cunning man, Hunter still embodies the gruff, haymaker-throwing, chisel-jawed hero seen in many other shows of the time. Susan Oliver as Vina gives a stellar performance. A character who's become completely trapped by the Telosians, attempting to enjoy the life she's been given, despite always knowing it isn't real. She has strong chemistry with Hunter and provides the emotional anchor for the audience. The rest of the cast isn't as well used, unfortunately. The character of Spock was yet to be fully conceived, and thus Leonard Nimoy's iconic screen presence doesn't quite appear in The Cage. Even Majel Barrett's Number 1, like pretty much everyone else, doesn't have much to do in this episode. The ending is also a little contrived. The usually powerful and near omniscient Telosians are quite easily subdued and captured by the end. Despite its problems, however, The Cage is a solid Star Trek story. The comparatively large budget allows for some terrific looking VFX, sets, and monsters. It features a lot of tragedy, but also a lot of fascinating concepts for the audience to ponder. While it isn't an all-time classic of Star Trek, it's still one worth several viewings from any avid Trekkie. The executives at NBC, however, weren't as impressed. It's easy to create the narrative that NBC simply weren't smart enough for this first pilot, but the truth isn't that simple. The executives were sold on a space western by the original pitch. This no doubt conjured images of saloon fisticuffs and quick-draw shootouts, but inside spaceships and brandishing ray guns. To be sold on this idea and then delivered a far more cerebral plot, which has our main hero imprisoned for most of the runtime, would be naturally disappointing. Further test screenings failed to convince NBC that Star Trek could work as a show, and so they decided not to pick up the series. However, in what is still a very rare occurrence for network TV, Star Trek was given another crack at the whip. This go-ahead for a second pilot came thanks to the co-founder of Desilu Productions itself. As mentioned before, Lucille Ball was a highly successful figure on TV at the time. During her career, she had often faced rampant sexism and was often pigeonholed into the kinds of roles she could play. Her sitcom I Love Lucy and other comedic work seems tame by today's standards, but at the time they were seen as boundary-pushing when it comes to the depiction of the loyal American housewife. Allegedly, while Ball didn't have much interest in the actual script, she was quite taken aback when she saw the first officer of the Enterprise was a female character. Recognizing the value of such a progressively minded show, she pushed the board at Desilu and NBC to go for a second stab at a pilot. Roddenberry had shown 3 scripts to both production companies for potential pilot episodes. While they had chosen The Cage, another script, titled Where No Man Has Gone Before, was well liked. Using some studio notes, Roddenberry rewrote the script to be turned into a second pilot. One such note was NBC's demand that the character of Number 1 be taken out. There are conflicting stories as to why this demand was made. Roddenberry insisted over the years that it was due to pure sexism. The NBC wouldn't allow the first officer of the ship to be a woman. Other accounts suggest NBC were concerned about nepotism. At the time, Roddenberry and Barrett had begun an affair which several production staff were aware of. Allegedly, this made some at NBC uncomfortable, and this may have factored into their demand to remove the character of Number 1. Whatever the real reason, Roddenberry certainly believed it was a regressive demand, and combated this by deliberately writing in a more racially diverse crew. He cast Nichelle Nichols, whom he had worked with on The Lieutenant, as Communications Officer Nyota Uhura. He also included an Asian character, Hikaru Sulu. Actor George Takei was encouraged to see such a non-stereotypical role being advertised, and successfully landed the part. It cannot be overstated just how important the mere inclusion of these 2 characters was. This was only 2 years after the monumental Civil Rights March on Washington, D.C., led by Martin Luther King Jr. The anger and violence being dealt to African Americans and other non-Caucasian ethnicities was forefront in many people's minds, and George Takei has often recounted his experiences being unlawfully imprisoned in a Japanese internment camp during World War II, in a chapter of American history many still try to sweep under the rug to this day. Rounding out the cast were DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. Roddenberry had briefly worked with Kelley on the pilot 333 Montgomery and got along well with the actor. James Doohan joined as engineer Montgomery Scott. The Canadian actor had a talent for accents and voices. It was a mutual decision by both Doohan and Roddenberry to make the character Scottish. As Doohan reasoned, the best engineers in the world are Scottish. When I was younger, I used to think Doohan's accent wasn't very accurate. That is until I found out he based the accent on an Aberdonian radio operator he encountered in World War II. For an attempted Aberdeen accent, it's actually not bad. In fact, Scotty sounds eerily similar to my high school chemistry teacher sometimes. Jeffrey Hunter had chosen not to return for the second pilot. After The Cage was met with a negative response, Hunter was unsure about committing to another pilot for the show and instead chose to pursue other opportunities. The new character of James T. Kirk was created, and Roddenberry's third choice for the role, William Shatner, accepted the part. Where No Man Has Gone Before brings up many interesting ideas just like The Cage did, but it has a brisker pace to its story which makes it a more enjoyable Star Trek yarn. We are introduced to the Enterprise as it attempts to traverse outside the galaxy, coming into contact with a mysterious energy barrier which soon grants godlike superpowers to one of the crew. The episode has a much more optimistic tone than The Cage did. A worn-out ship and captain are replaced with a colourful flagship and charming lead. Funnily enough, it was Shatner's more exaggerated style of acting which prompted Leonard Nimoy to skew closer to the more unemotional Spock we come to know. While the characterization isn't exactly in line with what Spock would become, Vulcans having a lack of emotion is firmly established here. An additional great performance in this episode is Gary Lockwood as Gary Mitchell, the crew member who becomes endowed with incredible powers. His brief dialogue with Kirk manages to establish a sense of rapport and friendship before the Enterprise encounters the barrier. Afterwards, his rapidly developing abilities and superiority complex turn Mitchell from a friend met with tragedy into a dangerous antagonist. A quirk of this performance results from the thick contact lenses Lockwood had to wear. The only way he was able to wear the lenses comfortably was by tilting his head way back. The resulting change in body language and demeanour enhances the transformation Mitchell is going through. The heady themes of humanity's cosmic evolution are fascinating, if only briefly touched on in this story. Instead, the true focus is on the characters, the relationship between Kirk and his former friend. This gives the episode a stronger emotional core as the audience is given a real relationship to invest in, not to mention more action with the first appearance of Shatner Fu. While it doesn't explore its themes in as much detail as The Cage, Where No Man Has Gone Before is overall more entertaining and emotionally relatable. With a stronger cast more well established, faster pace and more action, NBC was satisfied with this second pilot, and after a few months, Star Trek as a TV show was finally given the green light. For the TV show proper, Gene Roddenberry brought on several more key creative leads. Joining Herb Solow and Robert Justman, Gene L. Kuhn, a Western-producing veteran whose show Wagon Train was directly cited by Oscar Katz in his original pitch, and who would go on to create many of Star Trek's most famous icons, was also brought on. And finally, the key creative voice of Dorothy Fontana, credited as DC Fontana. She had been hired as Roddenberry's secretary during the production of The Lieutenant, and had contributed 8 scripts to various shows under a pseudonym. For Star Trek, she was promoted to chief script editor. The day-to-day production of Star Trek would mostly be handled by Justman and Solow, while Roddenberry, Kuhn and Fontana would contribute most to the storytelling of the series. It was this team which would ensure Star Trek deliver a slew of high-quality stories, and deliver them well. Season 1 of Star Trek is easily its strongest, with many of its most acclaimed and most classic stories appearing in its first year. The scripts were strong, often perfectly walking the line between complex sci-fi ideas and pulpy space adventure fun. And while the production values are dated today, the strong design work and colourful effects make it highly pleasing to the eyes. This was in large part thanks to the contributions of Matt Jeffries. Roddenberry first became aware of Jeffries when he viewed the 1957 movie Bombers B-52, on which Jeffries worked as a production designer. The two men had a terrific working relationship and friendship, both sharing a love of engineering. In total, it took Jeffries 2 months to create the design for the USS Enterprise. He reasoned that the engines of the ship would be powerful and potentially dangerous, and after consulting with NASA engineers, settled on a modular design, the saucer section taking inspiration from the flying saucers he had seen in many other sci-fi movies and TV shows. In the event of the engines becoming a danger, Jeffries reasoned that parts of the ship could be jettisoned to keep the crew safe. Indeed, the notion of a saucer separation was originally part of Jeffries' design, many years before it made an appearance on Star Trek The Next Generation. With a NASA consultation establishing the ship as modular, Jeffries brought in a few naval influences for much of the interiors, even modelling the layout of the bridge quite closely after real US Navy warships. With these elements combined, and an eye for simple aesthetic beauty, the iconic starship the Enterprise was born. Now, when it comes to choosing episodes to highlight in this video, there are many important ones to choose. There is the enemy below-inspired battle of wits between the Enterprise and Bird of Prey in the very first appearance of the Romulans, or the introduction of the Klingons in Errand of Mercy. However, being that the purpose of this new video series is to re-examine and improve on my previous videos discussing this franchise, I don't really see a need to come back to these episodes. I've already examined them in detail in my various top 10s and Lore Evolution series, which you can see elsewhere on this channel. So instead, I've decided to discuss episodes which I truly love, but aren't always as widely discussed in Star Trek fandom or in pop culture. Space Seed, for example, will be an episode I'll talk about in depth during my eventual retrospective on the Wrath of Khan. These are episodes I select when I want that quintessential Star Trek experience, and one in particular which I've always come back to for some sci-fi fun is the Squire of Gothos. This was the first instance of what would become a well-worn Star Trek trope, that of godlike alien beings toying with the Enterprise or putting its characters through some kind of trial. In the Squire of Gothos, the Enterprise encounters Trelane, an alien being who has been observing Earth from afar and has become quite a fan. However, due to some time dilation errors, he still believes Earth to be a warlike world and assumes Kirk to be a colonial conqueror of some kind, and delights in goading Kirk into showing his more savage side. The true highlight of the episode is easily William Campbell as Trelane. The actor is clearly having the time of his life in the role. His pure joy in discussing the concepts of war and violence is both amusing and quite sinister. I'd be extremely surprised if John Delancey didn't take inspiration from Campbell in crafting his own mischievous alien Q in Star Trek The Next Generation. It's also in Campbell's performance we get small clues leading up to the final twist. The way he throws temper tantrums and stomps his feet when he doesn't get his way is only made more appropriate when it's revealed Trelane is in fact a petulant child whose playtime has simply gotten out of hand. The way Campbell shifts intonations from a sadistic villain to a spoilt brat is hilarious to watch. The episode is also classic for its themes about human savagery. Kirk's insistence that humanity is no longer the barbaric race Trelane thinks it is concretely establishes the optimistic view of this future. At the same time, the character who relishes violence and warfare the most, turning out to be an irritating child, is a funny lampooning of such a mindset. While the Squire of Gothos isn't among the most profound Star Trek stories, it's certainly one of the most enjoyable romps in the series. However, similar themes brought up in this episode would get a more serious treatment in other episodes which I want to talk about. Arena is an iconic Star Trek episode, and one which is instantly recognisable in pop culture for its climactic Gorn face-off. But while this scene is often ridiculed as an example of the original series' dated production values, it's actually part of a very strong episode. Kirk, Spock, McCoy and a few others beam down to a Federation outpost to discover it has been attacked and destroyed by an unknown alien aggressor. After fending off the attackers on the ground, the Enterprise engages the alien craft in hot pursuit, culminating in a showdown with the alien captain. While Star Trek is largely inspired by the ray gun pulp adventures of the Hugo Gernsback style of science fiction, Arena is surprisingly brutal and gritty in its depiction of the initial alien attack. The chaos, confusion and trauma of the action is well captured by the script and well conveyed by the cast. What makes the episode so gripping, however, is the choice to keep the aliens unseen for the first confrontation and resulting chase. There's a palpable tension surrounding the mystery of these aliens and Kirk's apparent drive for revenge. That is until both ships are brought to a standstill by another godlike alien race, who set up the one-on-one battle between the two captains. The final reveal of the Gorn captain is actually highly effective. After Kirk has conjured this image of a barbaric attacker, even he seems shocked at the monstrous appearance of his foe. The resulting fight choreography is a little unconvincing, but the chases and traps which follow bring back that tension as Kirk realizes how truly outmatched he is. Only thanks to his intelligence and ingenuity is Kirk able to take down the Gorn, but just as he's about to strike, decides to let his foe live. Despite the Gorn's monstrous appearance and actions, Kirk realizes it too is an intelligent creature who possibly cares quite deeply for its own crew and its own people. Thus the godlike aliens, the Metrons, decide to let both captains and both crews continue on, convinced they are not as inherently savage as they both first seemed. It's perhaps a little contrived, but it's anchored by a strong performance from Shatner, who manages to convey his anger and determination over the attack on the outpost, but without breaking into his often parodied overacting. Much of his actions are based on assumptions and speculations, which we later find out to be unfounded. It's a strong script which examines the more savage side of human nature, something which is also examined in A Taste of Armageddon sees the Enterprise attempt to establish diplomatic relations with a planet which has been at war for over 3 centuries. However, upon arrival, Kirk, Spock and McCoy are confused to see no evidence of any prolonged war. It's soon discovered that this war is fought entirely with computers. All attacks are simulated, but the casualties are rendered real via disintegration machines, which inhabitants of the planet are expected to enter if they are simulated as being caught in an attack. When the Enterprise is registered as being destroyed, Kirk decides to bring the entire system down. It's an absurd premise, I'll give you that, which stretches the allegory to near breaking point, but the absurdity is part of what makes its themes and messages all the more impactful. The idea of a peaceful cooperation is seen as so impossible by these two worlds that they have deemed this system of a simulated war more reasonable. The episode is also noteworthy for a blatant violation of the Prime Directive, which forbids Starfleet from interfering with the internal development of other cultures. But this is an episode which harkens back to the pulpy ray gun fights and fisticuffs, while still delivering a positive social message. It may be a little daft, but it's one of the stronger examples of the wagon train format the show often went back to. Just as the titular wagon train of that show would journey to a new town and become embroiled in the ongoing affairs of that populace, so too did the Enterprise become a key trigger for change and tragedy to many planets it visited throughout its first season. As Season 1 drew to a close, Nichelle Nichols was feeling unsure about continuing with the show. Despite the importance of her casting, she and George Takei were rarely given much agency in the show, instead relegated to background supporting roles in each story while Kirk, Spock and McCoy took centre stage. Since the debut episode, many of the cast had been receiving letters from avid fans of the show, writing to their favourite characters in the series. Leonard Nimoy received the most following his performance in The Naked Time. Nichols, however, believed she was receiving none, until she discovered NBC execs had ordered all of her letters to be withheld. While no explanation has been given for this, Nichols believed this order had racist intentions, which is not hard to believe. While performing in Star Trek, Nichols had also received several offers from musical theatre productions, which Nichols had a background in. Seeing prejudice from her current job and opportunities elsewhere, Nichols decided to leave the show. She handed in her letter of resignation to Gene Roddenberry. Roddenberry, shocked at this decision, asked Nichols to take the weekend, and if she still felt the same by the following Monday, he would accept the resignation. What happened next was truly a stranger-than-fiction event.
I believe it was an NAACP fundraiser, but it might not have been, but I think it was. And so I went to do this on that Saturday night, and I had just been taken to the dais and sat down when the organizer came over and said, Miss Nichols, how are you, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, listen, there's someone here who said, he is your biggest fan, and he's looking chirpy, you know, and he said, and he's desperate to meet you. He really wants to meet you. So I said, certainly, and I stand up and turn, and I'm thinking, it's a Star Trek fan. He said, it's a Star Trek fan. I'm looking for a young man who's a Star Trek fan. I turn, and instead of fan, there's this face the world knows with this beautiful smile on it. And I remember thinking, whoever that fan is going to have to wait, because Dr. Martin Luther King, my leader, is walking toward me, not 10 feet away, with a beautiful smile on his face. And then this man says, yes, Miss Nichols, I am that fan. I am your best fan, your greatest fan. And my family are your greatest fans. He said, we admire you greatly, you know. And he said some more things, and the manner in which you've created this role has dignity and so forth, and he said, you know, and before he said, I said, Dr. King, thank you so much, and then I got the courage to say, and I really am going to miss my co-stars. And he said, what do you mean? Dead serious. What are you talking about? I said, well, I've had an off. He said, you cannot. And I said, well, I'm going to leave Star Trek because I'm going to say have an offer to star in. I never got that far. I said, well, I'm leaving Star Trek. He said, you cannot. You cannot. And I felt like that little boy Willis. What you talking about, Dr. King? But you know I didn't say that. No. He said, for the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day, as intelligent, quality, beautiful people who can sing, dance, but who can go into space, who can be lawyers, who can be teachers, who can be professors, who are in this day, and yet you don't see it on television until now. Whatever happened come Monday morning, I went to Gene, and I'm not sure to this day if I knew what I was going to say. And I told him what happened. And I said, if you still want me to stay, I'll stay. I have to. And he took out my resignation, which was torn into 100 pieces, and handed me the pile. And we just stood there looking at each other. And I finally said, thank you, Gene. And he said, thank you, Nichelle.
Despite the high quality of its first season, Roddenberry knew Star Trek would likely be cancelled due to its middling ratings at best. Anticipating the bad news, Roddenberry helped organise a massive letter-writing campaign from fans of the show, asking NBC to renew it for a second season. This campaign was enormously successful. NBC allegedly received more fan mail about Star Trek than any other show they had running at the time. Some fans even went so far as to picket the fences of NBC studios to show their support. It was this campaign which had played a major role in NBC commissioning a second season, but so too did demographics. For those unfamiliar with how TV Nielsen ratings work, the success of a show doesn't solely depend on the amount of viewers. This used to be the case where ratings were measured per household. However, during the late 60s, this began to change with the introduction of demographics, age and gender brackets, etc. As many TV networks depend on selling commercial advertising slots for revenue, the most desirable demographic for advertisers, and therefore for networks, was and still is the 18 to 35 bracket. While Star Trek wasn't scoring high overall ratings, it was scoring very well in this particular demographic, and so had the potential to be very profitable for the network. Also thanks to the letter-writing campaign, NBC was aware that many Star Trek fans were teachers, scientists, engineers, and other accomplished individuals. This gave the show a sense of prestige in terms of who was watching. These two factors motivated NBC to give Star Trek yet another chance, and renewed it for a second season. Season 2 isn't quite as good as Season 1, but still contains many great outings for the show. With a slightly reduced budget, it loses a little bit of the wagon train format. Less alien cultures and less location shooting, but still a strong season overall. Season 2 saw the introduction of Ensign Pavel Chekhov, played by Walter Koenig. The character was originally created to fill in for Sulu while George Takei was off filming The Green Berets. The character was intended to appeal to a younger female audience, even styling his hair to resemble Davy Jones from the Monkees. He was at first meant to be a native Englishman, but by this point in time, the USSR was badly beating the USA in the space race, so Roddenberry decided to make the character Russian, further emphasizing his vision of a united and cooperative humanity. As a young ensign, Chekhov is quite naive and passionate, getting easily swept up in romances or rising to the threats of bullish Klingons. Arguably, he had a lot more personality and stronger material than George Takei's Sulu. The season premiere, Amok Time, is a true classic of Star Trek. The crew become alarmed when Spock begins acting emotional and even violent. When McCoy discovers a chemical imbalance which threatens Spock's life, Kirk demands an explanation from Spock. He subsequently reveals that he has entered his Pon Farr, a physical condition which Vulcans enter into every 7 years, which drives them to return home and find a mate. Against orders, Kirk chooses to save his friend and returns to the Vulcan homeworld. Most episodes surrounding Spock are terrific stories, such as Season 1's The Galileo 7. As mentioned previously, Spock became an extremely popular character for his emotional complexity, and according to some fans, was quite the sex symbol. So a Spock-focused episode where he is emotionally unstable and in need of a mate virtually guaranteed an overwhelmingly positive fan reception. It's a great character-driven story. Rather than an entire planet or the Federation being at stake, the central concern is for Spock and his relationships with the Enterprise crew. It's also the first for many iconic elements in Star Trek. This is of course the first appearance appearance of Pon farr, but it's also the first time the phrases "live long and prosper" and "peace and long life" were said. It's also the first appearance of the Vulcan salute, which was actually created by Leonard Nimoy, drawing inspiration from a Jewish ceremony he once witnessed as a child. Overall, it's a strong season premiere which fans no doubt celebrated after their favourite show was almost taken off the air for good. Luckily, more great episodes kept coming. The Doomsday Machine is one such great episode. The Enterprise investigates a star system which has been reduced to rubble by an alien machine which originated from outside the galaxy. In its week of destruction, it has also left the USS Constellation and its commanding officer, Commodore Matthew Decker, a wreck. After Kirk and Scotty become trapped on the Constellation, Decker sees fit to take command of the Enterprise to exact revenge on the powerful Doomsday Machine. This is a classic Moby Dick allegory, which Star Trek would come back to many times. Guest star William Wyndham gives a brilliant performance, a man utterly broken by the horror he has witnessed. Not just from the machine itself, but from his own actions which inadvertently led to the death of his entire crew. Much of the episode consists of Decker throwing the Enterprise at the machine again and again in a desperate attempt to destroy it. Meanwhile, Kirk and Scotty work tirelessly to eventually regain control of their own starship before it's destroyed. It's an action-packed episode filled with extreme tension and tragedy. The simplicity of the overall plot allows the focus to remain on the characters, with only speculations as to the origins of this machine. But thus far, Amok Time and the Doomsday Machine are famously strong episodes from the original series. The next episode I want to highlight isn't as well renowned, but in my opinion, really should be. The Ultimate Computer is one of the first instances of Star Trek really grappling with the concept of artificial intelligence. However, rather than the far-reaching implications of what it means to be human, how sentience is defined, and other similar themes brought up in the likes of Blade Runner or Battlestar Galactica, the Ultimate Computer tackles a far older theme. Dr. Richard Daystrom boards the Enterprise to outfit it with the M5, an advanced tactical computer system which Daystrom hopes could one day completely automate ship operations so that no more crew members need die in deep space. However, the notion of his position as captain becoming obsolete is deeply troubling to Kirk. As with most sci-fi stories featuring AI, the M5 eventually malfunctions when it uses live weapons during a wargames exercise, murdering hundreds on the opposing Starfleet ships. The themes of the episode spin off into many avenues. The automation debate is one which remains highly relevant to this day, yet there is also the theme of exploration versus merely acquiring knowledge. The act of human beings journeying into space to see the cosmos for themselves brings with it scientific knowledge, yes, but there's also an emotional component to it as well.
Are you only interested in scientific discovery? Send robots. It's cheaper. You don't have to bring them home. You don't have to feed them, at least not food. They'll need energy from somewhere. Get it from the sun. If you only care about science, then there's no rational reason to send humans, really. For the cost of sending a human, you can send 100 robots. And robots are getting better, smaller, cheaper, faster, smarter, all of the above. But here's the catch. I've never seen a ticker tape parade for a robot. I've never seen a high school named after a robot. I never saw a kid read a book about a robot and say, gee, I want to be that robot one day. There's value of human inspiration. It's less tangible than the scientific results of an experiment. It's more emotional, it's more philosophical, it's more cultural, it's more human.
However, just like with the Doomsday Machine, this episode features a fantastic guest star, William Marshall, lots of Williams in this show, as Dr. Daystrom. Once again, this was pretty groundbreaking casting for an African American to play such a role. It's the classic tale of hubris, as Daystrom refuses to believe the M5 could have any flaws. But what I personally find fascinating is the revelation that the M5 has had Daystrom's own engrams imprinted on its systems in order to help form its operational matrix. Essentially, the machine itself has much of Daystrom's own mind within it. Thus, the failure of the M5 in the story is not strictly the result of machines being inferior to humans, but instead is a result of human fallacies impacting a machine. The episode successfully replicates the terrific sense of tension and brutality seen in Doomsday Machine as the Enterprise crew watch helplessly as their fellow Starfleet officers are slaughtered by their own ship. The ending is a bit of a cop-out, I'll admit, with Kirk catching the M5 in a logical loophole which ultimately leads to its shutdown. Despite this flaw, however, The Ultimate Computer is an episode which I think should be brought up more often by Trek fandom. What is often assumed to be a mad scientist / killer machine story is a lot richer on closer examination. A strange quirk of Season 2 of Star Trek is the presence of several parallel Earth stories. These are stories in which the Enterprise encounters an alien world which resembles some historical period from Earth for some contrived reason. Sometimes it's due to cultural contamination, someone from Earth manipulating an alien world. Other times it's pure chance that this world evolved along almost the exact same path as Earth did, which is pretty silly. Season 2 features several of these stories. The only really fun one is A Piece of the Action, in which an alien world has modelled its society after Prohibition-era gangsters. It's a ridiculous idea, but thankfully the episode doesn't take itself very seriously, instead reveling in the fun of Captain Kirk donning a striped suit and brandishing a Tommy gun with an over-the-top New York accent. Other episodes unfortunately take the concept too seriously to mixed results. Patterns of Force gives us a Federation cultural expert who somehow believed modelling an alien world on Nazi Germany was a good idea. The Omega Glory depicts a post-nuclear world so exactly like the feared result of the Cold War, right down to both sides being called Yanks and Commies, that one wonders why this wasn't a time travel episode. And Bread and Circuses simply wastes the idea of a Roman Empire which lasted into the 20th century technology level. It's likely these stories were a cost-saving measure, an excuse to reuse props and costumes already in storage, and shoot on standing sets at various backlots, rather than expensive location shooting. While none of these mentioned stories are awful by any means, they were an unfortunate indicator of where the show would end up. During the run of Season 2, Star Trek was successfully renewed for a third season, which would ultimately prove to be its last. Once again, the budget was slashed, ensuring virtually no location shooting for any episodes, which severely limited the scope of many stories. This season featured some of the worst episodes of the show, such as the Paradise Syndrome, which showcases insulting tropes about Native Americans, as well as Turnabout Intruder, an outright sexist episode at worst, and an awkward, unpleasant story at best. Many other infamous examples such as The Way to Eden and The Children Shall Lead and Plato's Stepchildren, which is outright embarrassing. This massive step down in quality can be largely attributed to the big changes happening behind the scenes. Gene Roddenberry, Gene L. Kuhn, Robert Justman, Herb Solow, and DC Fontana had been the driving force behind the show's strong production and storytelling. However, by Season 3, Kuhn, Justman, and Solow all left the show either before or during the season due to the exhaustion brought on by the grueling schedule. DC Fontana had found other work writing for other shows, but still contributed 3 more scripts to Season 3, which included the Enterprise incident, one of the stronger outings for the season. Even Gene Roddenberry had become weary of the demanding job, and so took on a less active role. Producer Fred Freeberger was brought on to effectively be the new showrunner, but without that core creative team, and with a much smaller budget, he had an extremely tough task ahead of him. Over the years, however, many cast and crew have blamed the poor quality of the season on studio meddling. For Season 3, NBC moved Star Trek to a Friday night slot at 10 PM, the exact time its valuable young audience would be out socializing with friends after a week of work and study. Indeed, this time slot is also the same slot which Joss Whedon's Firefly ended up in, and has often been named as the time slot of death, even to this day. It's quite possible NBC saw Star Trek as simply too much trouble for its worth. While it did score well with a valuable demographic, its overall ratings had been falling since Season 1. On top of this, the fierce letter-writing campaigns constantly made Star Trek a fixture of boardroom meetings. It's been estimated that the studio was spending almost $100,000 a year simply replying to the mountain of letters they were receiving about Star Trek, as it was an internal policy at NBC to reply to as much fan mail as possible. So it isn't unlikely certain executives decided to try and get the show cancelled, so they would never have to hear about it anymore. Unlike Season 2, Season 3 opens with a truly embarrassing addition to Star Trek canon, Spock's brain. While exploring space, the Enterprise is boarded by an alien woman who promptly knocks the crew unconscious. When they come to, they discover that Spock's brain has been stolen, and so Kirk takes the Enterprise on a fierce race against time to retrieve his brain and restore it to his body. Star Trek certainly has some outlandish concepts, But this is an absolutely ridiculous premise for an episode. There are certain constants in any universe, sci-fi or otherwise, and the efforts this episode goes to make this idea sound plausible are backbreaking. But beyond the central premise, the rest of the episode is easily some of Star Trek's weakest writing, full of worn-out cliches and poorly thought-out plot points. For those curious, myself and two friends actually did a commentary of sorts on another channel of mine, where we react to all the worst and most unintentionally hilarious parts of this episode.
Oh man, no, that's Spock.
I like Spock's new nifty headgear.
Looks like a pharaoh.
Yeah.
Come on, Bones, what's the mystery?
There is no mind.
Mate, this is fucking rubbish.
Link will be down below. Either way, Spock's brain remains one of the worst episodes in all of Star Trek. Its only valuable is in providing inadvertent comedy for its audience. That being said, Season 3 isn't totally bereft of good stories. There's the aforementioned Enterprise incident, as well as the debut appearance of the Tholians in the Tholian Web. But this time, I wanted to highlight an episode which is a little controversial in terms of quality, Spectre of the Gun. When the Enterprise intrudes into alien space, Kirk, Spock, Bones, Scotty and Chekhov are whisked away to a strange recreation of the old West Town tombstone where they are pitted against Doc Holliday and his gang in their famous standoff. It's a real head-scratcher of a setup as to the exact reasons the alien intelligence has done this, but the scenario plays out in a compelling way. There is a bizarre dreamlike, or rather nightmarish quality to the place the crew have found themselves in, with the half-constructed western town and oppressive blood-red sky. Along with its heavy atmosphere, the episode has a truly gripping sense of rising tension as Kirk and co try desperately to avoid the impending confrontation. They try leaving the town, telling the locals what's really happening, constructing a gas grenade to tip the odds in their favour, but nothing works. The final solution is either fiendishly clever or a deus ex machina, depending on who you ask. After evaluating all the facts, Spock concludes that they are in such a blatantly unreal place, where the constant laws of physics don't apply, that the coming shootout is only a danger if it's believed to be such. Thus, the Enterprise crew simply have to believe strongly enough that they cannot be harmed in this place in order to prevail. Personally, I fall into the former of seeing this as a clever resolution. The dreamlike atmosphere I mentioned before already enhances much of the episode, so it's a nice twist when the atmosphere ends up being a plot point in and of itself. A fresh take on humans evolving beyond savage violence, as previously seen in Arena. Unfortunately, by this point, the spark was gone. Even the fans who managed to stay in and watch were growing increasingly let down by the subpar stories being presented to them each week. The already mediocre at best ratings cratered. With its key demographic gone, and remaining viewers no longer happy with the show's quality, NBC finally decided the time had come and cancelled Star Trek. The last episode of Star Trek was broadcast on June 3rd, 1969. And for all anyone knew at the time, that was it. Star Trek was over forever. Roddenberry and the remaining creative staff moved on to new projects, landing writing and producing gigs elsewhere. Most of the cast were able to find reliable work on the stage and screen. They were happy to move on from a show which they believed had never achieved hit status and which had lost its audience. But of course, as the world knows, the story of Star Trek was far from over. Thank you so much for watching, guys. This video was a hell of a lot of work, as you can imagine. I'll be doing more retrospectives in this style for every other Star Trek installment, right up until Star Trek Beyond, so subscribe to make sure you see those when they come out. If you like what I do and want to help me grow the channel, you can support me on Patreon, where you can see videos early. I've also recently started a YouTube membership program, which also allows you to see videos early and grants you custom emojis such as the Data on Acid. Both platforms also have access to new behind-the-scenes videos I'll be making soon if you're keen on that. Special thanks to all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.